see.
Great. All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to training number 2 for the 2020 Stormwater Manual. Today's training is going to focus on policy, site evaluations, and sort of engineering design foundations. My name is Adrienne Iona, and I'm the manager for the team that put the Stormwater Manual together. I'd like to acknowledge them, Alice Coker, Ivy Dunlap, Amy Simpson, and Henry Stevens, some of whom are here today. I want to start with the training schedule overview. We had our general overview, which probably a lot of you have seen many times a couple weeks ago. Today, we are going to cover policy, site evaluations, and design. We'll be focusing on applicability, special circumstances, setbacks, geotechnical and infiltration testing, and engineering design storms and assumptions. Next week, we'll have a presumptive approach calculator training, and that's for the new pack, which is now live. We apologize for the delay, but it's available now, so you can look at that at our website if you would like to. And then on the 4th, we'll be covering private and public site design. So this will be really focused on kind of the facility configurations for both private and public Green Street facilities. Like I said, we'll be recording and posting the trainings, and then reach out to us if you have any questions or if you have any kind of particular topics that you would like us to focus on in these upcoming ones. Those are not finalized yet. So now we'll just dive into applicability. The new manual, a lot of these aren't new, but we've kind of consolidated our applicability criteria and organized them in these 4 categories: development or redevelopment of impervious area, new connections or routes of conveyance, landscape non-conforming upgrades, and retrofits. I'm going to go into some more detail on those. So just to start to talk about development and pavement triggers. So we still have our 500 square foot threshold for creation of new impervious area or redevelopment of existing impervious area. However, we have changed our definition of maintenance. It allows for exposure of the underlying gravel. So that means that we now allow maintenance for concrete replacement. However, pavement must be replaced in kind. So if you're switching from concrete to asphalt or the other way around, that does not fall under the maintenance definition. If you expose the underlying soil, then that will count as redevelopment. So projects that are doing full base repair, those are considered redevelopment. Our pavement exemptions, so we've kind of reworked these, although they're mostly similar to what we currently have. We've added a sort of outright exemption for additional pavement replacement identified during construction. This is things like, you know, if the pavement around your trench is unraveling and you have to do more pavement repair than you planned for in your design documents, that we're not going to like retroactively go back and make you redesign your stormwater facility. We exempt pavement restoration for utility service connections. And so these aren't going to kick you over this 50% street width trigger. And then we have our kind of consolidated pavement restoration in public or private rights of way for curb replacement in place, utility trenches, and base repair of public streets, where no more than 50% of the street width is removed or repaved. So when you have a combination of those things that kind of go over the center line for the length of your project, then the whole thing is going to trigger. But until you hit that threshold, then you can do that work without having to do stormwater. We've removed the blanket exemption for sidewalk and ADA only projects. These projects will now trigger unless that work is considered maintenance. And these projects will qualify for a new staff review special circumstances process, which I'm going to talk about just in a minute here. Now, also locations with existing curb will now trigger stormwater if they meet the other criteria. However, many of these projects will be considered maintenance. Now I'm going to go to a couple examples of sidewalk construction and kind of how we're looking at these different areas. So here's a scenario where your existing conditions are a 6-foot wide curb tight sidewalk and where PBOT is requiring kind of moving that sidewalk back to create space for a landscape strip or tree wells. So in both of these scenarios, the triggered area will be considered the hatched area. So place that space where new sidewalk is constructed that didn't exist before. The overlap area will be considered maintenance, and that's that tan color. And then the green area is landscape and doesn't require stormwater. This other scenario where you're moving the curb into the road to make a wider sidewalk. Again, in this scenario, the hatched area will be stormwater will be applicable to that, but the tan area will be considered maintenance because it's replacing existing sidewalk in place. So if you kind of add all these things up, here's kind of how we see the anticipated impacts to right-of-way projects. So if we look at projects that will typically require stormwater, those projects will be projects adding new pavement, including ones that are building new sidewalks or expanding existing sidewalks. Projects that are moving the curbs in or out and changing those pavement types. Projects doing base repair of greater than 50% of the street width, and projects doing a combination of pavement replacement that adds up to greater than 50% of that street width. Projects that are typically not triggered will be projects where the curb doesn't move and remains in place. Those will likely fall under the maintenance exemption if kind of you're putting the right of way back kind of how it was before, depending on kind of how much work you're going to be doing. And then additionally for PBOT minor improvement projects, BES currently does not review those for stormwater, and we will continue to not review those for stormwater. We did an analysis of a group of those projects, and they regularly fall underneath the 500 square foot threshold. And so we're not concerned about missing those for stormwater. We've changed our applicability for vertical construction. So this was that additions and enclosures requirement where if you were adding to an existing structure within an existing building footprint, we were requiring stormwater. So we've increased the threshold for this and are now going to only be applying this applicability when that new area is greater than 10,000 square feet. So we're really looking to target this at really big projects. And under the 2016 SWMM, we were, doing a lot of stormwater for, enclosing kind of, open air areas that had like awnings over them, kind of. We've made some clarifications to our applicability to new connections and non-conforming upgrades. Um, for new connections or routes of conveyance, we've set that threshold at 500 square feet for a catchment area. We've explicitly said that it doesn't count as a new connection if you're changing it within the same system. So if you're moving from this pipe to that pipe, and then if you're changing between ownership, however, if you're going from, say, a private storm outfall to a public storm system, then that would be considered a new connection. And we've explicitly stated that installing a new curb where one did not exist before counts as a new route of conveyance. We've also made a few small tweaks to the landscape non-conforming upgrades. We used to call this parking lot non-conforming upgrades, but it really applies more broadly than that. We have also included the 500 square foot threshold in that category. And we've moved this from kind of a random place in the manual to live formally underneath applicability. We've re-looked at retrofits and the applicability of the SWMM to retrofit projects, and we've established 3 separate categories of retrofits: city required retrofits, retrofits required by state or federal agencies, and owner initiated retrofits. And then we've sort of outlined the specific requirements that apply to each of those. So for city required retrofits, those are required to meet all of the stormwater manual requirements. For retrofits required by state or federal agencies, these are often kind of DEQ required retrofits for industrial properties that have their own stormwater permits. Those were requiring to meet the site evaluation and O&M requirements around, infiltration and geotechnical, and then we're requiring an operations and maintenance agreement be filed. And then for fully voluntary, like owner initiated retrofits, these are kind of your typical like single family home rain garden kind of project. We're not requiring compliance with the stormwater manual. We've also added a lot more detail about the relationship between the SWMM, the city, and the port for port projects, and have outlined kind of this applicability as it relates to their different kind of property classes. So this is in the manual and hopefully will make that relationship more clear. From a policy side, we've changed the hierarchy. We've split out the determining the discharge point from selecting a facility. So kind of separating these 2 distinct decisions. For a discharge point, we've collapsed the 2 infiltration categories into level 1. So we still prioritize on-site infiltration, either with a surface facility or a UIC. We do have an exception for this for properties that install a qualifying eco-roof. And then, so that's level 1. And then level 2 is offsite discharge to a storm only system. And level 3 is offsite discharge to a combined system. So then separately, you just select your facility. We still prioritize infiltration and vegetated facilities. And that kind of acknowledges the multiple system and kind of benefits and kind of urban, environmental improvements that those facilities provide. We've added a lot more detail around our receiving system requirements. We are requiring sites to have an approved discharge to an approved receiving system, and that these 4 systems, groundwater, surface water, piped systems, and existing stormwater facilities, are the 4 different receiving systems we've included. So in this section, we talk about UIC regulation and registration in the groundwater section. Um, we have some ability to ask for downstream analysis for discharge to surface water. That would mostly apply to really large projects. And then we've retained some ability to require additional flow control for discharge to pipe systems when the capacity is very constrained. And then we've provided more guidance for discharge to existing stormwater facilities and how you determine whether that facility can handle the new area that you're proposing with your project. We've also added a new section on decommissioning stormwater facilities and what to do when you're removing an existing facility. So we have sort of the non-UIC facilities and the UIC facilities, and that's different for both of those. For private facilities, we do require that the function is replaced if that was installed per the SWMM, and require updates to the operations and maintenance agreement. For public facilities, BES has to approve removal of that facility. And in either of these cases, private or public, we may require kind of a retroactive special circumstances fee payment for removal of that facility if that function is not replaced. For private UICs, We sort of point people to DEQ for that decommissioning process, and then state that any offsite discharge, so if you're going from a UIC to an offsite discharge, then that would count as a new connection. And then for city-owned UICs, we point people to our RBE, our internal UIC program that manages that. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about special circumstances. And there are two kinds of special circumstances requests. We have a new staff review special circumstance, and we have the existing committee review. We've now kind of added that committee review specificity in front of that to kind of distinguish the two. Special circumstances is available to projects where it's not technically feasible to construct a stormwater management facility, and those projects are charged an offsite management fee of $3.70 a square foot, and that money pays gives the city a fund to pay for offsite mitigation, and we do that through our Percent for Green program. Which if you're interested in, I think we'll be opening up applications again in the next few months. So just a quick review of the committee review special circumstances. This really hasn't changed, but projects must justify technical and feasibility. That things like that typically include right-of-way facilities that are so steep that where the road is too steep and it's the facility footprint is not going to be very efficient, or on sites where the grades just really don't work to get the stormwater from the area to the facility that you're constructing. Those are reviewed by a internal BES committee and are approved or denied. Pavement is made at building permit. This also applies to city projects. So applications for this are submitted along with your permit application. There's a $100 application fee. The BES Systems Development Reviewer completes a 3-day review for completeness. And then after that application is deemed complete, the committee will meet and render a decision within 21 days of that. So we have a new staff review special circumstances, and we've created this for those sidewalk and ADA projects that are no longer exempt. For this process, there is no application fee. We're not asking for additional justification that it's technically infeasible to provide stormwater management. We're assuming that it's kind of impractical for these projects, for these project types. There is no committee review. The staff reviewer can approve this if the criteria are met. So we've set some pretty narrow criteria. So this process applies to projects that create, expand, or replace sidewalk behind an existing curb in the right-of-way, projects that create, expand, or replace pedestrian paths or walkways that cannot otherwise be managed. That's primarily on private property, and projects that add or replace impervious area to meet Americans with Disabilities Act requirements. For the way we're going to be implementing this, as there are a few kind of, more things to describe around this. In these search situations, the applicant can choose to build a facility instead of paying the fee. However, BES will not be able to require applicants to construct a facility if the site qualifies, if the work qualifies under those criteria. However, I think generally if there are other parts of your project that do require construction of a facility, BES's preference would be to make that facility larger to treat this contributing area. If a new impervious area is treated with existing or proposed facilities, then we would not be requiring the application or the fee. So this will happen a lot in our sumped area in outer East Portland. In those locations, no staff review special circumstances fee would be necessary. So areas that don't qualify for those specific criteria for sidewalk and ADA must either build a facility or apply for the committee review special circumstance. So there's definitely a scenario where you could potentially have staff review special circumstance and committee review special circumstance for the same project. Um, so the staff review special circumstances fee covers both pollution reduction and flow control requirements. There might be some situations where we would need to still find an approvable discharge location for water originating off of new impervious area. These applications can be reviewed and approved through land use, um, building permit, or public works permit. All right, now we're going to dive into sort of site evaluation and engineering design considerations. So, from a site evaluation perspective, kind of the primary question that this focuses around is whether whether infiltration is feasible or not. And the things that we look for when trying to determine that are the possibility of landslide risks, whether there's contamination on the site, whether the geology, whether the site has fill material, what the soil types are, what the depth of the groundwater is, and what the infiltration rates are on that site. So we've added a lot more information around infiltration at sites with contamination. So generally, BES discourages infiltration at contaminated sites, but in some instances, the applicant or BES may have compelling reasons to infiltrate at that location. Um, Generally, the applicant is responsible for determining whether contamination exists. We've added some information in the manual, reference locations to do research on that for a particular for your site. So, and this sort of covers the two scenarios: one where BES would like an applicant, a site to infiltrate, even though there is a contamination, or when the applicant wishes to infiltrate and BES is concerned about the potential impacts from that. So, if an applicant does not want to infiltrate due to contamination, BES may require sort of additional site environmental investigation, demonstrating that contamination and demonstrating that doing stormwater would not be would be problematic with that contamination. And then to infiltrate at contaminated sites, um, where we will ask for a geotechnical and environmental evaluation that demonstrates that that would not cause adverse impacts. Similarly to infiltration on sites with fill, so for sites with engineered fill, we'll require geotechnical investigation and documentation that supports the proposed infiltration. And on sites with undocumented fill, generally um, generally we prefer sites not infiltrate when there is undocumented fill. That's typically not acceptable. However, there are some scenarios where you could potentially infiltrate below that fill, and that does not create as many problems. And on these sites, we would require a geotechnical investigation showing that long-term infiltration is feasible and not likely to result in adverse impacts, primarily from a structural standpoint. We've added more information on requirements for borings and depth to groundwater investigations. BES will typically require Borelog soil classifications where geotechnical investigations are performed. Um, so if that work's been done, then we want to see the Borelog soil classification information. And we've also added some more information on the required depths of borings on sites. We've edited our groundwater measurements. So we do require the 5 foot of separation for surface infiltration facilities and UICs. The separation requirement for surface infiltration facilities is new. We've reduced the time for groundwater measurement stabilization to 1 hour instead of 24. And we mostly don't require depth to groundwater investigations, but the time that we do require that is if seasonal high groundwater is less than 50 feet below the ground surface. We've done a lot of work around our infiltration testing guidance. Um, this kind of better acknowledges the wide range of soil conditions that we have in Portland, um, from sites that drain really slowly in the West Hills to sites that drain really quickly out in outer East Portland. And really the kind of the way the tests work and the timing for them really varies depending on kind of what your geology is. Overall, there will be less time required to complete the tests. Um, and some examples of that, we've reduced the pre-soak time to 1 hour instead of 4 hours to overnight. And we've provided a little bit more specificity around pit tests where we're not allowing unlined auger holes. And we've provided standard excavation and water um, depth kind of requirements for that test. We've set a maximum test depth required by BES for if as an applicant you do infiltration testing down to 30 feet, we will not require that you go back to do additional testing to determine if infiltration is infeasible. Applicants will be allowed to do deeper testing if they would like to. But we want to kind of minimize the amount of time that applicants are remobilizing to do additional infiltration testing. We're providing more detailed guidance for encased falling head and direct infiltration tests. And that guidance includes information on what to do if an excavation cannot, if your site can't, if your soil can't hold a head on that water. And we're providing guidance that a minimum of 250 gallons be used to do a test in those situations. For the simplified pit test, we've set standard excavation depths, 2 feet for facilities that are up to 2 feet deep. So those are the primarily surface infiltration facilities, and 3 feet for facilities that are deeper than 2 feet. So that's typically for UICs. And we're requiring a sort of 2 by 2 foot hole for that excavation. We've increased the water depth required to 12 inches, and but we've reduced the duration of the test. So instead of having it be that you had to do the test until the pit was emptied, you have to do it until it's emptied or for at least 1 hour. We've added information about our setbacks. We removed setbacks for infiltration facilities adjacent to the right of way. So now surface or vegetated infiltration facilities can coincide with your 5 foot landscape buffer for a lot of sites. We've updated the section about dry wells under buildings. We've clarified setbacks for mini dry wells, rain gardens, filter strips, downspout extensions, and ponds. We've added a discussion for projects that propose that to encroach into a setbacks and have better outlined the requirements for structural and geotechnical justification for doing that. We removed setbacks for sites that have 10% slopes, and we're sort of explicitly stated that there are no setbacks required for line facilities or permeable pavement. There's a new table that summarizes those setback requirements, and then there's additional information for specific facilities that have setbacks that vary from these standard setbacks. Now I want to go into kind of the changes that we've made that impact facility sizing, and these are primarily kind of engineering design changes. Where we've increased the water quality design storm, we've changed some of our flow control standards. We've changed our engineering assumptions for some of the facility design kind of parameters. The combination of these changes primarily impact fully lined facilities and facilities with under drains that are designed using the PAC calculator. There were minimal changes made to the sizing for simplified approach facilities. So the changes we made to our engineering assumptions, we've increased the design infiltration rate of our blended soil from 2 inches per hour to 6 inches per hour to better reflect field observations. We've set pre-development curve assumptions for pre-development curve numbers based on hydrologic soil group, and that's to kind of remove that guesswork at design. And those will now be based on the NRCS soil type. We've increased our water quality design storm. We've increased it to 1.61 inches to continue to meet our MS4 permit requirements. And that 1.61 inches, that's for the 24-hour storm event for the Santa Barbara method. The size for the rational method for rate-based facilities has not changed. So this will primarily impact facilities that are lined and those with under drains that are sized for water quality treatment only. Those are typically sites that aren't required to do flow control that discharge to the slough or the Willamette River. So even with this large increase in the size of the storm, those facilities still remain relatively small. The smallest facility is really in the city at less than 2% of the catchment area. So the other changes we've made are sizing for flow control requirements. We've modified our flow control requirements to make them achievable with reasonable facility sizes while still meeting the sort of the system needs that we have for protecting streams and the combined system. So the combination of those, I've sort of highlighted the key changes here. We'll be requiring more orifice control on facilities. And then we've also created this sort of separate sizing criteria for catchments that are too small to meet flow control requirements with the minimum orifice size. And at those sites, you'll be required to filter the 25-year, 24-hour storm event without overflow. And then for the storm only separated area, we've changed the flow control criteria for the 2-year event. So previously the requirement was to control the post-development 2-year to half the pre-development 2-year. We're now requiring that half the post-development 2-year meet the half the pre-development 2-year. It's a minor change, but it makes a difference in terms of kind of getting facilities that work and that are sized reasonably. And then the flow control for the combined really hasn't changed. The primary change there will be the combination of these engineering assumptions that are different and the introduction of orifice control. So when we look at the combination of all of those things and how they impact facility sizes, so like I mentioned before, water quality only facilities, and these are primarily constructed in the slough and along the Willamette, those will get larger, but they still will be kind of relatively small at less than 2% of the catchment area. For areas in the flow control in the MS4 system, these will, for lined facilities that discharge offsite on the private side where they can pond more, those will be around a similar size to what they are now and be less than 6% of the catchment area. The size of public right-of-way facilities that are limited to 9 inches of ponding, those get larger and are at about 8.5% of the catchment area. For infiltration facilities, surface infiltration facilities, in some instances will be able to be smaller. And that is primarily because we've increased that assumed infiltration rate of the growing media from 2 inches to 6 inches per hour. So now the footprint of the facility won't be restricted by that 2 inches per hour if your native soil infiltration rate is higher. So Now they'll be able to be sized up to 6 inches per hour as opposed to being limited to 2. So depending on your site conditions, those facilities might get smaller. And then for flow control and the combined, um, because of the combination of that increase in the infiltration rate of the growing media and the addition of orifice control, facilities on both private property and in the public right of way um, can still meet those flow control requirements with a smaller facility footprint. All right, that's the end of my content slides. I want to kind of put the training schedule back up here. We had our general overview a few weeks ago. We're now in this training number 2, policy site evaluations and design. Next week, we'll have the training for the presumptive approach calculator. And then in early February, we'll be doing the private and public site design training that will cover facility configurations, private facilities, and public green streets. There'll be more information in that training, particularly about the changes to the under drain configuration and orifice control. Again, trainings will be recorded and posted, and please reach out if you have any questions or additional, requests. With that, I will leave it to questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And so feel free to post things in the chat or to raise your hand. Any questions? Maybe not. Oh, Tom's here. Hi, Tom.
Hello. I'm laughing because you said that particular way. I was just noticing one thing that I wanted to make a comment about. It's not really a question. You mentioned the word reasonable size.
Mhm.
And as a landscape architect who's worked with a lot of architects and engineers, it's always been my experience that the engineers often are sometimes excessively concerned about the size of a facility, indicating that the size sometimes is difficult to achieve and that type of thing.
Mhm.
And I found that on any project where there's a collaboration of at least the two, if not all three, the architect, landscape architect, and civil engineer, that it's often usually easy for the architect and landscape architect to help find room because they control so much of the space. And so I'm a little concerned if you put too much attention into reasonable, and if that reasonableness was related to only the engineering aspect or opinion or perspective.
Yeah.
Put it that way.
I'd say, Tom,
Thank
I totally agree. And I definitely, sometimes when we're looking at special circumstances applications in particular on private property, um, we don't like to approve ones where we feel like sites have not done their due diligence in terms of design and have kind of put stormwater off to the last minute and have not considered it. Um, the I think the primary concern we have in terms of facility footprint is really for vegetated facilities in the right of way. If we were creeping up on some numbers for meeting flow control in the MS4 area at more than 10% of the catchment area, and they're just because there's so much limited space, um, and there's so much competition for that, we're particularly sensitive to the amount of room that stormwater takes in the right of way in particular, and particularly in Southwest where it's much more challenging to find that, and those facilities need to be larger. But I agree with your statement about, good site design versus kind of putting stormwater off to the last minute.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ivy, I can see the chat because I stopped sharing, so I might just dive in here.
Okay, that's great.
Okay, so Nicole wants to know about the 10,000 square foot of added enclosed vertical construction on private property. So Nicole, that's really about, if you have a building that's already built and you're like putting an extra floor on that, your stormwater goes somewhere, right? It usually goes into your downspouts and into the pipe in the street. And really this is sort of what counts as a big enough project that we would require them retrofitting stormwater to meet the SWMM requirements. And so that water still has to go somewhere, and it can go where it has been going. It's just whether we're requiring them to retrofit in stormwater facilities to comply with the SWMM or not. Hopefully that answers your question. And then, yeah, increasing the soil medium to 6 inches per hour. We're also excited about that. And sidewalks are tricky. I agree. So Nicole says that she's concerned about discretionary staff allowance for adding sidewalks, still using the terms technically feasible instead of practical. Yeah, I think that's a good point. However, for the sidewalks, for the staff review special circumstances, for those, we do specifically state that we assume that those projects, that it is technically infeasible to do stormwater for those. And that's just because of the nature of the work. If you're adding 2 feet to an existing sidewalk for 3 blocks, it's pretty hard to kind of collect all of that water in one place and put it in a facility. So I think we have acknowledged that on that side. And hopefully that will be, we'll be able to successfully implement that.
Thanks. I just wanted to comment that, I think that the good faith is that that's how it's going to be handled. But, in my experience in working for the city, policies tend to morph over the years and sort of grow their own legs. And it also allows some staff to interpret them differently. I mean, I could probably name 3 or 4 policies right now that just drive me crazy because some people just use the language as a tool to beat people with versus practical implementation. And I'm not saying this is BES, but it's one of those things where I get concerned about language like that because it does provide that interpretation. So I mean, that's just my thoughts. I have all the confidence that we have a good faith agreement moving into it, but it does have a lot of impacts on PBOT and our ability to get sidewalk in at some point, where we don't want to make the ability to get sidewalks starting to become, everyone has to go do a public improvement, public works project basically to get put sidewalk on their frontage.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I definitely agree with your challenges with interpretation and how kind of individual or personality dependent that can be, and how that can change over time with staff changes.
Thank you guys, I appreciate it. And I'll definitely plan on attending the facility design one too. So I said it at the beginning, but good work. I know you guys worked really hard to roll this out. So
yeah, thank you. And thanks for all your input too. Any other questions? Everybody's read the manual already and completely understands it. All right, well, so I think that maybe since it's kind of quiet, we should stop the recording. And then